He taught them without words, but now only silence remained. And they had to remember the lessons before it was too late. He taught them without words. He taught them with shadow, with stillness, with the way he stepped between danger and breath. Tao had been gone for 7 years, and still, the herd moved as if he had only just turned a corner. Amali, his mate, had grown slower in recent seasons. Her joints ached, her eyes dimmed, but each morning, she still walked to the hollow near the grove where Tao had once dug the first trench. The water no longer filled it like it used to, but she stood there. She remembered. And the triplets, they had become adults. The largest of them, tall, broad, with deep-set eyes, moved with confidence. He led the migration lines, tested the soil before the calves crossed. They called him Kumo, for the way clouds seemed to gather over his shoulders whenever he stood. The second, more reserved, quieter, had become a protector. He kept the young in check, circled the stragglers. They said he had his mother's eyes. He answered only when needed. And then there was the youngest, smaller, slighter. But he remembered differently. Where others saw Tao as past, he saw him as present, in the breeze over the field, in the sound of earth cracking after rain, in the pauses between one footstep and the next. He bore no title, but the calves followed him when he walked. Even the old bull sometimes waited when he hesitated. His name was Tembo. They never told him he was like his father. They didn't have to. The grove had changed. Trees had grown taller, but water came later each year. The ground cracked wider in the dry months. Birds no longer nested low. And still, Amali stood each morning before the trench Tao had dug. One morning, Tembo stood beside her. Neither of them spoke, but both knew something was different. The trench was dry, drier than it had ever been. The air smelled wrong, thicker, more still. The sky was clear, but the silence carried weight. Amali shifted uneasily, her ears flicked. Tembo stepped forward. He lowered his trunk into the trench and breathed in. No moisture, no depth, not even ants. He looked to his mother, but she was already walking. Away. No warning, no sound. She just walked. Tembo didn't follow at first. Amali had wandered before, often alone, especially since Tao. But this time, she didn't glance back. She passed the outer grove, crossed the old stream bed, vanished beyond the tall stone ridge where Tao once shielded her during the drought. By the time Tembo followed, her tracks were already scattered. The dust didn't settle. The herd waited until sunset, then the next. Amali didn't return, and for the first time in 7 years, the grove felt empty, not because of her, but because Tao's silence no longer answered back. Tembo stood beneath the old oak that evening, just as his father once had. The calves stirred nervously. The elders whispered, and no one said it aloud, but they all felt the same truth. If Amali was gone and the trench was dry, then Tao's time had truly ended, unless someone carried it forward. And so, Tembo turned to the east, toward the dry lands where Amali had disappeared, and walked alone, just as his father once did. But this time, there was no calf following, no mate to shield, no trench to dig, only silence and memory. Tembo walked, not because anyone asked him to, not because he believed he could bring her back, but because he remembered how his father used to walk, not towards something, but away from the silence that grew too loud to bear. The air was thinner past the ridge, fewer trees, more rock, less shade. The sky above the canyon cracked with heat, even in the early hours. Tembo followed dry riverbeds, hoping to catch her scent, a track, a branch disturbed. But there was nothing, just dust. For 3 days he moved alone. On the 4th he found a trail, faint, not fresh, but too wide for any animal but her. The path curved around a bend and disappeared behind a collapsed fig tree. Tembo paused at the roots, pressed his trunk into the soil, still warm, still recent. The memory returned like thunder behind his eyes. Tao, all those years ago, standing in the exact same posture, head tilted, breath low, feeling the world through his skin. Back then, Tembo didn't understand it. Now he felt it, not just where his mother had gone, but what she might have been searching for. He moved faster after that, no longer just following, tracking. On the 6th day, he reached the edge of the salt basin, a place few elephants crossed. It burned hooves, reflected too much light. Even the wind tasted like iron. But there, etched in the hardened mud, was her print. And next to it, smaller ones, not calves, not hyenas, not elephants. Tembo leaned down. The prints were human. He froze, not out of fear, out of memory. Because he'd heard stories, murmurs from the old matriarchs, of the time Tao once stood still in front of men. Not to fight, not to flee, to shield. Tembo raised his trunk, listened. Nothing. No voices, no metal, no movement. Still, he pressed forward. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he circled the basin's edge until moonlight turned the white surface into silver glass. And just before dawn, he saw it. A figure, lying on its side, half buried in dust. Not his mother, too small, too still, but close. He approached slowly. The scent hit him before the image did. Old blood, metal, fabric. It was a human, a young man. Shirt torn, arm bent unnaturally, a metal container lying beside him. A broken radio. He was alive, barely. Tembo stood over him. The man opened one eye. Didn't scream, didn't move, just stared and whispered, "You look like him." Tembo didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the way it sounded like awe, like memory. And suddenly, from beyond the ridge, a call, faint, fractured, Amal. Tembo turned toward the sound, then looked back at the man. He couldn't carry both. He couldn't guard both. He couldn't choose both. But one voice was calling now, and the other reminded him of his father. He closed his eyes and listened. Tao used to say nothing, but in his stillness, he always made a choice. Tembo stepped toward the man and stood over him. Not because it was easy, not because it was right, but because Tao would have. Tembo didn't move for hours. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow, skin cracked from the sun. Flies circled, then scattered whenever Tembo shifted his weight. He kept his trunk close to the man's chest, not touching, just near enough to feel the rise and fall, to listen, to wait, like Tao once did. When the man finally spoke again, it was in fragments. "Didn't know they could do this. Thought you'd leave. You look like him." Tembo didn't understand the words, but the tone, soft, reverent, uncertain, was the same kind of silence Tao had always answered with presence. So Tembo stayed. The sun dipped lower. Tembo's ears twitched. A sound, far away, rhythmic, mechanical, a vehicle. The man stirred, struggled to sit up, then collapsed again. But he smiled. "They're coming. I told them about her." Tembo blinked slowly. Her. He tilted his head. The man reached feebly toward his satchel. From within, he pulled out a crumpled photograph, held it in shaking fingers. "She came through the basin, took down a fence, didn't hurt anyone, just looked at us, like she knew." Tembo leaned closer. The photo was grainy, sun-faded, but it was her, Amal, alone, surrounded by men in orange vests and wide-brimmed hats. Cameras, drones, a bulldozer in the background, but she stood tall, unbothered. The man whispered, "She stayed for a while, watched us build. Then she left." He coughed. Blood. She didn't run, just turned, like she was waiting for someone. Tembo's breath hitched, not out of fear, but because he understood. She hadn't wandered. She had chosen. The sound of the vehicle drew closer. Dust rose on the western ridge. Tembo stepped back. The man looked up. "They'll help, I think. Tell them, thank you for staying." Tembo didn't know what a thank you meant, but the way the man said it, it felt like Tao. He turned, walked east, toward her. For the next 2 days, he moved faster than he ever had. Each hour brought new tracks, new bends in the land, but no sign of her, only echoes. A broken branch here, a mound of disturbed earth there, a single strand of grass pressed flat. On the third day he found her, not lying down, not trapped, but standing, at the edge of a dry gorge, staring across a newly built dam. The water that once fed the grove was gone, diverted, held back by steel and noise, and Amale was just standing there, watching. She didn't turn when he approached, but her ear flicked once, and then she sighed, softly, and Tembo felt something crack in his chest. He stepped beside her, pressed his forehead to hers. They didn't move, didn't need to, because the trench had dried, the old basin was blocked, and everything Tao had built, everything he had protected, now rested on them. Amale lowered her head, and Tembo understood. She hadn't come here to protest. She had come to remember, to stand witness, to wait, until someone else was ready. Tembo turned toward the dam, studied the lines, the angles, the gaps, and somewhere deep in his bones, Tao's memory stirred. Not with words, but with movement, because Tao never stood still without purpose, and Tembo had waited long enough. Tembo stood at the dam for a long time, not as an elephant, but as something else, a presence, a decision, a memory made flesh. He scanned the steel and stone, the rows of metal piping, the pulsing turbines beyond. Water pressed against the wall, held back, redirected, waiting. He didn't understand the machines, but he understood the silence they had replaced. Behind him, Amale shifted. Her trunk brushed the earth once, twice, then paused. Tembo knelt, pressed his own trunk beside hers, felt the vibration, low, steady, faint, singing, from beneath, from the river that once fed the basin, from the ground that Tao had once read like scripture. Tembo rose, began to walk, not away from the dam, but alongside it, tracing the edge. His steps were even, calculated, measured in silence. He passed the warning signs, the tire tracks, the unmanned drone perched on a nearby post. He passed them all, until he reached the old riverbed, now dry, but not dead. And he dug, not wildly, not like the desperate. He dug the way Tao once did, with intention. Imal joined him, quietly, without instruction, without command. She pressed her body into the work, not to move earth, but to bear witness. By nightfall, the trench was a shallow groove. By morning, it was wide enough to hold light. By the second morning, it held water, a trickle at first, then more, then a bloom of green at its edges. They had not broken the dam. They had bypassed it. When the engineers returned, the trench was already echoing with birdsong, and in the center stood Tembo, still, unmoving, like a statue cast in memory. They didn't approach, didn't raise tools, they just stood, watched. Some filmed, some whispered. One removed his hat. A new calf arrived 3 days later, the first in over a season. She was Amale's granddaughter. She walked unsteadily, tripped, tumbled into the shallow trench. Tembo pulled her out gently, used his trunk like Tao once had, lifted her not by strength, but by trust. The herd returned slowly, first the oldest, then the watchful, then the ones who had always followed Tembo without knowing why. Now they knew. Tao's presence had never faded. It had simply changed form, no longer a shadow, but a current, carried through steps, through water, through choice. And when the next dry season came, they didn't wait for rescue. They began digging, side by side, even the calves, even the youngest, because Tao had taught them without words. And now Tembo had reminded them how to listen. And the silence that followed was not absence. It was memory, a living presence. It moved through the herd like wind through tall grass, not loud but impossible to ignore. The calves stopped roughhousing near the water's edge. The young bulls, usually eager to show dominance, began pausing before charging, glancing at Tembo's posture first. And the matriarchs, once doubtful of the youngest triplet, now walked just a few paces behind him, not ahead. Not because he demanded it, but because they chose to. At night, they gathered around the new trench, now flowing freely with soft currents and life returning in droplets. Tembo never stood at the center. He stayed near the edges, where Tao used to stand, where wind passed, where light met water in silence. The calf, Amale's granddaughter, was now strong enough to walk longer distances. She followed Tembo closely, imitating his pauses, his turns. Even the way he lowered his trunk to test the soil. She had no name yet, but the young ones had started calling her Echo. One evening, as a storm passed far to the north, the herd stood in near total stillness. A low hum rolled over the plains, not thunder, but the kind of pressure that made leaves tremble and birds wait. Tembo lifted his head. The others followed, and then, without instruction, they moved, single file, toward the older grove, toward higher ground. The rain didn't arrive, but the silence did, and in it, they listened, not for danger, but for rhythm. The rhythm Tao once walked in, the rhythm Tembo now restored. News of the trench spread, not through language but through footprints. Other elephants, strangers to the herd, arrived during the hottest days, stood at the water's edge without challenging territory. Some stayed, some left, but all of them drank. The researchers returned too, cameras in hand, notebooks filled. But something was different. They no longer tried to direct or interrupt. They just observed. One young woman, new to the team, stood beside the trench at dawn and whispered to no one in particular, "We don't need to measure this. We need to remember it." She knelt, placed a flat stone beside the water's edge. Etched into it with her own hands were 3 words. He remembered first. In time, the trench was known by another name. Not a technical one, not a mapped one, just a whispered one: Tao's return. Not because Tao had come back, but because his way had, through Tembo, through Echo, through the ones who had learned not by being taught, but by watching, by waiting, by trusting. Tembo aged slowly. He never grew as large as his eldest brother, never as wide-chested as the second, but he outlasted them both. Not in years, in memory, because long after he stepped back from the path, after his legs no longer moved like before, after his voice, even in vibration, grew faint, Echo began to walk differently, not in his shadow, but in his shape. She led not by strength, but by quiet, not by speed, but by pause. And the others followed, just like before. Not because they were told, but because once, long ago, someone had reminded them how. And once a lesson becomes memory, it no longer needs a teacher. Echo began to lead with small things. A sideways glance when the wind changed, a halt before crossing brittle ground, a slow circle around an injured calf, not to lift it, but to be near. Tembo watched from behind, never correcting, never guiding, only witnessing, the way Tao had. One morning during the season when the air hung heavy with dust and no rain came, Echo led the herd down a narrow valley, one the matriarchs usually avoided. The elders hesitated, so did the calves, until she raised her trunk. Just slightly, not high, not forceful, just enough to catch the wind. And with that, they followed. They found a pocket of green at the end of the valley, a shallow pool, the last water for miles, and for the first time, Echo stood at the center, alone, not beside Tembo, not behind the matriarchs, and drank first, not in dominance, in permission. Tembo stood at the edge, old now, his skin loose around the bones, his trunk slower, his breath measured like the earth beneath his feet. But his eyes, still and steady, watched Echo the way his father once watched him, without fear, without pride, only trust. In time, Echo began to sleep nearer to the younger calves. They curled beside her flank, the way she once had with Amale. Tembo moved farther out, preferring the edge of the grove, the outer circle of the herd. And sometimes, in the silence between stars, he would imagine Tao there too, still, watching. And then one morning, as the sun split the horizon in long golden rays, Tembo didn't rise. The herd gathered around him, no panic, no noise, only presence. Echo stepped forward, lowered her trunk to his chest, then his cheek, then placed her forehead gently to his, not to say goodbye, but to say, "I will not forget." They buried him beneath a wide tree near the first trench, the one Tao had dug, the one that still flowed. The calves gathered wildflowers, not because they were told, but because they'd seen the researchers do it once, and because Tembo loved the sound of petals in the wind. Echo stood over the grave until nightfall. The sky turned to ash, then to silver, then to black. And she didn't move. Not until the youngest calf, the one born only a week before Tembo passed, approached her. He didn't speak, just pressed his side into hers, and Echo lowered her trunk around his back, as Tao once had, as Tembo had after him, as she now would for others, because this was how the herd remembered. Not in song, not in stone, but in gesture. A pause before a storm, a glance over the shoulder, a shadow cast long at dawn, each one saying, "We are still walking together. Even if you don't see us, we are here." The words were never spoken, but they moved through the grass with every step. They echoed through the soil when hooves pressed into the ground. They fluttered between trees with the shift of wide gray ears. And they settled, invisibly, undeniably, into the hearts of those who watched quietly enough to feel them. The youngest calves no longer rushed toward water first. They waited for Echo's pace, not because they feared her, but because they trusted her. She didn't trumpet commands. She didn't chase or correct. She led with presence, with stillness. At the edge of the grove, where the wind carried dust in long ribbons, Echo often stood at dusk and listened. Not for threats, not for direction, but for continuity. To feel if the world still moved the way it had under Tembo's watch, and under Tao's shadow before him. She would tilt her head, press her trunk to the earth, close her eyes, and in those moments, the herd waited, every time. And then one day something strange happened. A lone giraffe, young, thin, ears torn, approached the outer ring of the trench. The herd watched silently. Echo took one step forward. The giraffe lowered its head, paused, then moved on. No one moved to chase it. No one sounded an alarm, because there was nothing to fear, only something to witness. In the trees nearby, two vultures nested lower than usual. In the pond's shallows, a heron lingered longer at dusk. And even the monkeys, noisy and impulsive, began to settle near the herd without mischief. It was as if the stillness radiated, not as dominance, but as permission. A small group of researchers, observing from a nearby outpost, began recording not just elephant behavior, but bird migrations, predator activity, rainfall patterns. One of them, a woman who had studied the herd since Tembo's rise, wrote in her journal, "It's as if the land listens differently here, as if the silence is not absence, but structure." In a quiet moment, she approached the trench alone. She didn't bring equipment, just a notebook. She sat beside the stone where it said, "He remembered first," and beneath it, she wrote, and she carried it forward. The wind shifted. Echo looked up from the edge of the grove, eyes locked. Just for a moment. The woman didn't move, didn't wave. She simply nodded, once, and walked away. That night, Echo circled the grove. She touched each calf with her trunk, briefly, gently, one by one, as if counting, as if remembering. Then she stood beneath the wide tree, where both Tao and Tembo now rested, and she raised her head to the stars, not in grief, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement, because she understood now. Legacy wasn't made by those who stayed forever. It was made by those who left enough behind to remind others how to stay. Because staying wasn't always a matter of presence. Sometimes it meant standing for something. Sometimes it meant remembering who stood before you. And sometimes it meant stepping aside so others could step forward. The youngest females in the herd began to copy Echo, not by design, not by command, but by instinct. They waited longer at the water's edge. They nudged fallen calves with care, not impatience. They paused before decisions, not to doubt, but to feel the soil, the wind, the silence between sound. And when a storm rolled across the western sky, Echo didn't lead the herd away. She let the calves decide the direction, and they chose the high ridge, the same one Tembo had once walked alone. It rained hard that night, but the herd did not scatter. They huddled, close, still, deliberate. Not one broke formation, not one panicked. And in the morning, when the sun melted the sky into soft gold, the ground around them was untouched by flood, because they had stayed together. That season, the trench fed more than just elephants. Gazelles came, warthogs, even a mother leopard, cautious and silent, drank once while Echo watched. The herd didn't chase her off. They stood still, watched, understood. That water carried more than sustenance. It carried intention. Echo's name, once used only among the calves, began to ripple outward. Other herds began to follow the trench lines she redug. Newborns were brought to drink at sunrise, and elders walked the trail Tembo once carved, their trunks brushing tree bark as if tracing a memory. One night, under a silver moon, a younger female stood beside Echo near the water. She didn't speak, just stood, waited. Echo lowered her head, gently touched trunks, and stepped back. The female stayed in her place, did not move. The herd quietly shifted behind her. Echo watched and knew it had begun again. Not a reign, but a return. Not a title, but a transfer. Far from the grove, a young boy in a distant village asked his grandfather, "Do elephants talk?" The old man smiled. "No," he said. "They listen, and they remember louder than most things speak." The boy thought about that, then asked, "What do they remember?" The grandfather looked out across the plains, where the light met the wind in slow currents. "Each other," he said, "and the ones who showed them how." Because teaching doesn't end with one generation, it moves like wind, picked up by those ready to feel it. Far beyond the grove, herds that had never seen Tao now dug trenches before rain. They stood still when calves cried. They waited for the weakest to catch up, and no one told them to. They just did, as if some shared rhythm passed through the dust and heat and memory, as if leadership could echo. Birds began nesting closer to the herd. They didn't fear stampedes. They understood the pauses. Foxes skirted the outer paths, not fleeing, not threatening, just moving with. Even the insects, it seemed, learned the pattern, cross in the quiet moments, wait in the stillness. It was as if the entire plain had adopted a breath slower than its own, a breath that belonged to someone who had once stood in silence and changed everything. Back at the research outpost, the journals grew thicker, but the entries grew shorter, not because less was happening, but because the watchers had learned what the elephants already knew. Not everything worth remembering needed to be written. Some things were better felt. One researcher, after years of filming the herd, retired early. She left her footage untouched. No narration, no subtitles. Just long, unbroken scenes of the elephants, drinking, resting, pausing, choosing. The final clip in the archive was of Echo, standing beneath the great tree at dusk, not moving, not reacting, just being. As the wind picked up and the light shifted, she turned slightly, looked at the camera, not at the lens, at the person behind it, and then she blinked, not slowly, not meaningfully, just naturally, and turned away. The screen faded to black, no music, no words, only a single line in silence. She was never alone. Nothing was spoken, but everything was said. Years later, no one remembered the exact day Echo stopped leading from the front. It just happened. She began walking a step behind, letting the younger ones choose paths, test water, lead migrations, not out of weakness, out of trust. She had taught them what Tembo once showed her, what Tao once showed him, without words, without reward, only rhythm, only presence. One dry season, the trench nearly emptied. The elders stirred uneasily. The calves grew anxious. But no one rushed, no one panicked. They waited, just like Tembo once did. And on the third day, the sky cracked open, and the rain returned. They didn't call it a miracle. They didn't trumpet to the heavens. They just drank, side by side, and moved on. Echo passed quietly during a season of plenty. There was no ceremony, no announcement. Just one morning, the herd gathered beneath the tree by the trench, the same one that shaded Tembo, that once covered Tao, and they stood in silence. All of them. Even the calves. Even the birds. Even the wind. No one moved for hours. Not until a small elephant, barely weaned, barely balanced, walked to the trench, lowered his trunk, and dug, just once, just enough to disturb the topsoil, and from beneath, the water shimmered up. No one told him to do it. He just did, because he had seen, because he had listened, because someone long ago had reminded the herd how to stay. And so they did, through drought, through flood, through fire, through time. The tree still stands, the trench still flows. And every so often, in the amber light of early evening, a figure appears at the grove's edge. Not large, not loud, but still, always still. Some say it's the wind, some say it's shadow, some say it's nothing. But those who truly listen, they know. He never left, she never faltered, and the herd never forgot. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who listens in silence, just like Tao once did.